There are tons of things that the average player believes, like the rock, paper, scissors meta, or Smurfs ruining their game to lose this queue, and everything in between. So in this video, we're going to go over 10 common beliefs that Overwatch players have and break down whether they're right or wrong and how you can become better at the game. But definitely smash that subscribe button. Only about 20% of you are subscribed, and it would be a huge solid for me. I want to get to 80,000 subscribers, and we're really close. Anyways, let's jump into the video. Now, the first potential misconception is you need to play the meta in order to actually climb in Overwatch. Now, you would think that everyone would know this is false, but tier lists are still the most popular type of content in Overwatch, and even videos talking about the best characters to main or not main in a particular season get a lot of traction. And while I think that these types of videos can be helpful tools, and we use them and post them on this channel as well, I think a lot of players are using them incorrectly, trying to very closely follow their hero picks with what is meta or being played at the high levels of play, and thinking that that will get them a higher rank. So what is the truth? Is meta super important to know and play, or is it something that you should ignore entirely? Well, here's the reality. Most of the time, tier lists and metas are based on pro or high level play, meaning that when we get to the upper echelons of the skill ceiling, a meta takes place based on every character being played at a rather high positional, game sense, and mechanical skill level. Now, you need to understand that sometimes, especially in a game like Overwatch, when characters are viable based on the viability of other characters, everything kind of intertwines and relies on each other, to the point where if you have one character that's not being played right in a optimal composition at the high level, then that all of a sudden could make the entire composition not work, and then all of a sudden the meta is different. So knowing this means that when you take what is objectively meta at the highest ranks of play or in pro play, and you try to apply it in ranked, or especially the lower ranks of play or even the average ranks of play, the compositions and the characters that see play at the highest level or the meta can just fall apart and crumble. And that's not even talking about the individual characters' impact themselves. Characters like Tracer and Widowmaker can be phenomenal picks when you're at the upper ends of mechanical skill, but for most players, these characters will never be meta for them. On top of that, we see almost every single character represented in the higher ranks of play, with at least one main or someone that plays every character being in top 500 in most seasons, and at the very least in the higher tiers, high masters, grandmaster rank, even if they're playing an off-meta character. So this means that if your goal is to get to Grandmaster, or your goal is to get to top 500, you can do it with just about any single character. So does that mean that we should take meta and throw it out the window? Well, kind of. Especially as you start to climb the ranks, I really think it's important to understand a meta and why it sees play, because a couple of really important factors. Number one, it actually tests your game sense and increases it when you understand why certain characters are seeing play, why certain characters are really strong when played optimally, and it also helps you kind of dissipate some of the other misconceptions you can have, like, you know, one character counters another, or you can never play like a Winston against a Reaper, or whatever the case may be. But pro play and high tier play can show you that the game is more than just really simplified matchups, which we'll talk about later. And in addition to that, understanding what is objectively really strong and really weak from a balance point of view relative to previous patches can help you know what characters of yours have a power increase going into this next season, or characters that you want to learn will have an easier time getting value than they have in previous seasons. And you'll also know what characters to expect and what characters will be played most often. And this is important because even if you're playing something that goes outside the norm, knowing how to play against the very popular characters that see play game after game is going to give you a leg up on your competition. So no, you shouldn't throw tier lists out the window. In fact, it's actually good for you as a player to develop by watching these and understanding why a meta exists. I would also suggest watching high rank play and pro play, but it's also something that you shouldn't feel super attached to the point where you're warping your entire play and your entire understanding of a game around it. You got to find a balance there, but that's my answer. Now, the next potential misconception that we have is just do damage and you will climb. Now, is this a misconception, yes or no? I would actually say no, this isn't a misconception. Doing a lot of damage and being damage-centric is actually a really important skill set and a really important thing that you can do in order to climb. And I do think that a lot of people fall into this trap, and it's getting better as we kind of move towards a more damage-centric meta, especially as of Season 9 and going into the future. Damage is more important now than ever, especially with supports, but really, it's been that way for a very long time, where supports would get away with being more heal-centric, and in Overwatch 1, this happened even more so, where you actually got more value with healing, but going on to Overwatch 2 and beyond, damage was something even more important than it was in Overwatch 1, and it was something that you needed to learn how to interweave with healing when it was necessary, but damage pressure all the time. And I think the idea of doing more damage is a really important lesson to teach, but it is important to know that it's just one part of your play, right? Knowing to damage and to damage often is good, and it's great to know, but it's also equally as important to know when can you get value by not damaging? When can you get value by actually healing a player? When is that call to make? Knowing when to swap between damaging and healing, knowing when to position, your game sense, your understanding of interactions, your positioning, how to get into a good position that can allow you to deal damage. There's so much more to Overwatch than super simple instructions. And I do think that simple instructions could be nice because they're really easy to teach and they're really easy to absorb, and you try not to overcomplicate it. But I think that if you want to really improve, you need to embrace complicated. Like, you can't just have everything super simple. Overwatch is not the game for you if you want simple answers to everything. Overwatch is one of the most strategically complex shooters that you'll find, with a ton of different factors that can affect team fights and a ton of different things to learn. And the things that you need to learn constantly evolve. And I do think that it's really important that we don't run away from learning the things that we should in order to make the game easier for us to maybe get some temporary improvement where we're just going to do damage, we're just going to focus on mechanics, and then we run into brick walls with our development later on and we don't know why, and it's really because we didn't learn some of the harder things that we were trying to avoid with some oversimplifications. I think that can actually hurt your development in the long run. So I do think dealing damage is important, but also don't try to take the easy way out when you're trying to get better at anything, and Overwatch is included in that. The next up is just swap to counter. And we mentioned this about meta, but I think this is something that happens a lot in games where people just swap to counter something, swap to counter the Widow, swap to counter the Winston, or the idea that rock, paper, scissors exists in the game where everyone is just swapping to counter each other. And there's a couple of truths to this and there's a couple of misconceptions to this. So first off, yes, you can swap to counter to give yourself advantage matchups against things, and certain characters counter harder than others to the point where they can mitigate certain strategies from characters. But this doesn't mean that just because someone swaps to your counter, it doesn't mean that you auto lose. There's a couple of things that need to be true for that to actually happen. Number one, it's impossible for you to adapt, and the reason that it would be impossible for you to adapt is maybe your team is losing if you're playing in a way that doesn't allow you to not get countered, because you're like maybe playing more passive or whatever the case may be, and it's not doing enough to help your team and secure you the win. That could be true, but you need to make sure that's actually true and it's not in your head, or you're not kind of creating a self-fulfilling prophecy where you kind of decide that automatically. You're like, if I don't do this, my team will just lose. Even if that hasn't been proven to be true over the course of multiple fights, you're just kind of assuming that will be true, and I think that some people fall into that category. Or you believe that you need to be the carry in a game, and you can't be the carry if that person is playing someone that counters your carry playstyle. And so these things can be frustrating, but there are ways to outplay these players. Understanding that sometimes when players, or even often when players swap to counter, they're not necessarily swapping to something that they're comfortable with all the time. There are going to be players that you run into that are truly very, very good at multiple characters, including counters, and that's a skill that they earned and they learned. And if they can swap to a counter of yours and perform really, really highly, even if they aren't directly interacting with you all the time, then it's going to be kind of rough, and you're going to be penalized in some way by not being flexible or able to swap to something yourself. That being said, it doesn't mean that if you're unwilling to swap, you're incapable of adapting. Because if you're good enough at the character that you have put more time into, because instead of the opponent that spent all this time on a lot of different characters and became more of a flex god, you have become someone that is more of a specialist, capable of getting value even up against your counters and finding the gaps in between an opponent's ability to interact with you to find ways to carry fights and have large amounts of impact. There are a lot of these situations that exist, and it's one of the reasons why one tricks can still succeed. There are tons of one tricks in Grandmaster, like we talked about in the meta section. These characters and these players go up against their hard counter all the damn time. Every ball main that you've ever seen at any rank has gone up against a million Sombras. Every freaking Widowmaker has gone up against Sombras too. Okay, we're going to talk a lot about Sombra. Junkrat mains went up against Echoes and Pharah's pre-flight change. And there's just a laundry list of examples that can happen where characters counter other characters, but you don't just fold to them. You don't just evaporate. And the better you get at a character, the better you're able to adapt, and the harder and harder it gets at countering you. Now, I'm not saying that you should one trick, because there are situations where they are countering you so hard with characters that they're already good at, and you're just gonna be kind of packed up by multiple members of the enemy team. But I will say that countering isn't the end-all be-all in Overwatch, and if you are someone that only plays the counter game, you need to consider how that affects your development as a player. And if you're someone that just completely folds at the first sight of another character on the enemy team, no matter how good that person is, you need to look inward at your own play and say, maybe there's things that I can do to actually still succeed even in the face of those counters, like a better player that played my main would do. So just think about that. Now, next up, we do got to talk about Scoreboard, and this is a really big one because I think Scoreboard transparency was one of the biggest things that we asked for going into Overwatch 2 and we finally got it. But now people, instead of the medal system of the past, they use the Scoreboard as a way to flame and roast players, right? Oh, you have this amount of kills, this amount of deaths, this amount of heals, whatever the case may be. The Scoreboard is something that is used to attack people. And the reality of it is, yes, the Scoreboard matters. And this is just straight up true. Stats do matter, but it's about how they matter. That's the problem. And it's not just as simple as looking at you did this amount of damage, you're bad, versus this amount of damage, you're good. Because there's a huge amount of subjective nature to things in Overwatch, depending on the character you're playing and the style or the strategy that you're incorporating. Like, as an example, if I'm Widowmaker, I am never going to do as much damage as any character that is spamming damage because I'm not poking as Widow. I'm doing burst damage or nothing. In that situation, I would not have a lot of trash damage. I would not have a lot of damage. But even if I'm playing a poke character, someone that can output a lot of damage, if I'm Junkrat and I go on a flank and I sneak up behind them, but right before I go for a play, my team's like, look at this Junkrat with no damage, you're freaking trash. And then I one-shot their Ana, and then I apply a whole bunch of pressure and maybe kill someone else, and I made a play that carried the whole team fight. But right before I did, I had someone that flamed me for my damage, right? And I'm not saying me personally, I would never play Junkrat. That's disgusting. I'm saying hypothetically, it's super important to understand that there is a super subjective nature to how these stats come out and at what rate they come out. There could be an optimal strategy generally, but that doesn't mean in a moment that you go for an unoptimal strategy or an unorthodox strategy that might affect stats in a certain way. I think getting the context of things matters far more. Dying completely solo when you didn't need to go aggressive when your team was respawning, or generally getting first blooded on your team when you had all your resources, or wasting resources pre-fight. There are situations of things where people make legitimate mistakes, but it's important not to just take the Scoreboard objectively and try to apply that as my teammate is good or bad, because a good majority of the time, it doesn't paint the full picture. And I think it's only used to attack people when it fits the narrative of who you want to flame, and no one stops to look at a scoreboard in a game that they're winning where people have weird stats. They don't say, wait, why is this stat happening like this if we're just dominating them? It's because stats are subjective and they don't paint the full picture. Now, the next misconception we got to talk about is my teammates hold me back. And I did make an entire video on this, Elo Hell, but of course, this is false. You do not have teammates that completely hold you back, although there are going to be times and moments in games where your teammates do. This is a 5v5 game. Every single player has a certain amount of impact, and you're not going to be able to carry every single game you're in. Even if you're someone that has a higher than average impact every single game, you are only going to have a higher percentage to carry or win that game than a normal person, which means over the course of enough games, you will climb. This does not mean that you will instantly climb. And this doesn't mean that you couldn't get the bad end of luck and go on an 8-loss streak, even if every game you performed better than your opposition on the other roles, you performed better than your teammates. You could have done that and still gone on an 8-game loss streak. That is 100% possible. It's unlikely, and it becomes increasingly more likely the more you lose. That's just math, especially if you're overperforming. But it is important to understand that you will have variance that you cannot necessarily control, but if you consistently have higher impact over enough games, you will climb. You 100% will. Now, one of the problems that happens is some players don't understand when it actually is their fault. And this is something that is true for every player, where some of the plays and things that they do actually cause their team to lose situations, but maybe their stats don't reflect it, or maybe they do so much good in a game that they don't realize the bad that they've done in a game that actually have costed them the game. Like, a great example of this is you go into a fight and you kill like 3 people, and then your team loses the fight, right? And you're like, what the heck? So you respawn earlier than your team, you run into a fight and die, and then your teammates end up in a situation where they get pushed and they die because they have less numbers, right? And so on the stats, you are 4-2, while your team might be 2-2 or 1-2 or even 0-2 or whatever the case may be, and you're like, what the hell are y'all doing? But you were the one that fed that second fight. So the stats don't reflect that. The stats don't reflect your mistakes. And there's a lot of situations where people make mistakes that they tend to wash over, but they don't realize that they are making these really vital mistakes. And even in games where you don't make as many mistakes as your teammates, it's really important to hold yourself accountable to the mistakes you do make, because if you want to become a higher tier player, someone capable of carrying and climbing to the higher ranks of play, you need to hold yourself to a higher standard than the people around you, and you need to make it so that you are playing as good as you possibly can and constantly getting better game after game. It's one of the many reasons why I say you should watch back your own games, especially games you were particularly frustrated with, trying to find your own errors and things that you could have done better. Now, the next misconception we got to talk about is stats matter. And I'm not talking about scoreboard here. I'm specifically talking about like deaths per 10. I'm talking about your healing per 10, your accuracy, stats that you can find in your account profile. Do these matter? Because a lot of people like to use these as some indicator of skill. I have this amount of accuracy, this amount of crit rate, this amount of anything, right? And I think it's really important to understand that this is kind of similar to the scoreboard thing, but a little bit different. So it's similar in the fact that you can't always trust these stats. Like, in fact, some of these stats could be actually the thing that's holding you back. You could be Mercy with a crazy high healing stat per 10, and you're super proud of it, but you should be damage boosting, and you're actually playing incorrectly to climb, but you're proud of a stat, or you think that a stat kind of shows off that you're good. And you might even say, you're a shit Mercy, you only have this amount of heals per 10, or whatever the case may be, and it's just a really bad stat. Or maybe you're using like an accuracy stat, but you're taking so much less shots than an opponent, or there's a million different factors. And I'm not saying that you shouldn't try to get better deaths per 10, less deaths per 10, higher accuracy. All these things are good things to work towards, but I think anyone that over obsesses with stats misses out on the bigger picture of Overwatch, where ultimately stats don't decide your individual decisions throughout a game. They don't talk about situations that you clutched or didn't clutch, your accuracy in a height moment, the amount of sleeps you hit, when the sleep actually mattered that you hit. There's a lot of things that can change and affect when a stat actually matters. So yeah, it's really important to try not to get caught up into these too much and make it so that you base your entire game and improvement off these things, because they don't necessarily mean all that much. Now, another misconception that comes up a lot is mechanics are all that matters. And you might actually think that this one will be false, right? I'll say that. And I would say that this is actually false if I said all. But mechanics do matter a lot more than most people give it credit for. I think the Overwatch community values mechanics less than most other communities, where other communities are doing this crazy aim training, practice, aim labs, things like that, and really putting a lot of time and effort into developing their mechanics. In Overwatch, you don't see that nearly as much. And the reason is there's a lot of ways to improve in Overwatch. Game sense, positioning, playing characters that don't require complex mechanics. But I do think it's really easy for players to get caught up in the overall game sense and positioning of the game and neglect their mechanics. And this goes double for someone that is on freaking minute 18 of like a 25-minute video, right? Because you're someone just watching this, and I'm not trying to you know, characterize you or anything like that, that watches guides and wants to get better, right? And there's a tendency for players that do want to get better and do watch guides and do research and do want to improve their game sense to kind of ignore one of the most important things about the game, which is mechanics. Because you make the right play on paper, but you can't hit your shots, it doesn't matter. If you are standing in the right position, but you can't use that position as well as someone else could with better mechanics, then it doesn't matter nearly as much. Mechanics are tied to every aspect of your play, and it's really important not to neglect that. It doesn't matter how much you know about the game. If your mechanics are lagging behind, you will have a really hard time climbing, and it's really important to be honest with yourself about that. I always love to use analogies, but it's like the football player, right, that wants to learn every which technique to get the better tackle, get the better catch, get the better throw, whatever the case may be, but is unwilling to hit the freaking weight room. Because sometimes all that matters is that motherfucker is 300 pounds of pure muscle and you're 100 pounds soaking wet. Sometimes it doesn't matter about technique, right? And we all know this. We all know that sometimes the raw ability is what matters and mechanics matter. They do. And it's really important that you don't neglect them. Now, the next misconception that comes across is equipment doesn't matter. And typically when people say this, they quote people like EQO that got to freaking top 10 as a pro player when he did it on like a freaking trackpad and like really small desk space or whatever the case may be. And people that got to really high rank with a terrible monitor and a terrible mouse. And I would say that equipment doesn't necessarily make or break you as a player. And that's true. It doesn't make or break you as a player outside of really, really extraneous circumstances where you have like truly awful equipment, right? But it does matter for a lot of players. It ups your enjoyment, your ability to improve and grind, and it can be the thing that pushes your skill just enough over the edge that will further your development down the road. And there are equally as many players that have climbed to a high rank with bad equipment as there are players that all of the sudden got their equipment good. They had tremendous increase in their skill and progress. Players like Space, who was playing casually with friends and then got good equipment and really tried hard, and have even quoted to say that using, bad equipment is like using a wiffle ball bat to play baseball, right? I think really if gaming is your passion and getting better is something that you're really, really set on, you want to give yourself good tools to do so for many reasons outside of enjoyment, even to just have a more natural progression in your skill without the need of extraneous talent. Now, the last misconception that we definitely got to talk about is loser's queue. And I think this is the one that a lot of people believe. They believe it very deeply. And I'm going to say that loser's queue, in the way that a lot of people believe it, is not true, but there are some true aspects to loser's queue. So let's talk about it. So first off, this is what most people believe about loser's queue. They believe that if you win enough games, you could be put in a queue that is designed to lose. A queue that is designed to make it so that you will lose and you will continue to lose until the system deems that you've lost enough and now you can go back to winning because now you're performing or whatever the case may be, or you've had enough losses, right, to balance it out, and everyone's just going to stay 50-50, right? And some people even believe it's like an algorithm thing where they want to keep the dopamine high in a certain way to like make it so you keep playing, whatever the case may be. But here's the truth. The more you win, especially if you keep winning on a win streak, the system does have things in place to test you, to judge you, right? It's like you're destroying, dominating level after level in a game, and they throw you a raid boss to see, can you actually beat it, right? And some of these games are tests where they actually have the odds stacked against you to the point where if you succeed in this much harder game to win, a game that the system doesn't even really believe that you will win, you'll get rewarded with more rank, right? And this is something that has actually been reflected transparently now than it has been in the past. In the past, we just kind of had to figure this out all by ourselves. But it is important to understand that a game can test you in a lot of different ways. It can throw you a hard game in a lot of different ways. Sometimes you're going to be the player that is in a sea of players that are all better than you, right? You're going to be the odd one out, where the system's like, if he's really good enough, he's not going to sink here. He's actually going to be decent and do all right in this lobby. But sometimes it's going to do something different. Sometimes it's going to have it to where your teammates are worse than you, and the enemy team is better on average than your team, but if you perform well, then it's even. So it actually expects you to be the carry. So instead of expecting you to not sink, it's expecting you to carry. And there's different situations, all different situations. Sometimes it'll be you and another player on the enemy team that are both the carry, or you and another player on the team are both bad, or the badness is going to be spread. You got to think about everyone has a number of their skill level, and it's kind of trying to balance the numbers. But if you keep winning in a row, it's projecting you to be a higher number, so it wants to test that. It wants to actually put you in a challenge. And this can feel sometimes like a loser's queue, especially when we combine it with the crazy things that we can't control that can happen to us game in and game out, where there's inconsistencies. And we talked about that when we said teammates don't hold you back. So yes, it can feel like it, and in some ways it's true, but it isn't ultimately the thing that will keep you down forever, because here's the truth. Every player that has ever climbed to any rank in all of Overwatch has had to win enough games overall to get to a higher rank, right? They had a positive win rate. They beat players that were on paper better than them, but they proved themselves to be better. Now, I think I actually skipped this misconception for some reason. Perhaps I'm just tired, but the number 7 was Smurfs ruined the game, and I think that this was an important one to revisit because a lot of people think that because there's Smurfs in the game is actually ruined, and it ruins the competitive integrity, things like that. I do think that there is some truth to this, and it is unfortunate that there's so many Smurfs. But something that you should keep in mind is there are going to be games that you also win because there's Smurfs on your team. Slightly less chance of you having a Smurf on your team because you're not a Smurf, but it's almost even the amount of chances you have to have a Smurf, 4 versus 5. And also, it is important to understand that similar to the loser's queue, similar to the teammates hold me back, every person that has ever climbed authentically, and you can't deny that there are people that have actually climbed by getting better and improving, these players have all had to play against Smurfs. Smurfing has been a big part of Overwatch since the dawn of time. It has always been a big part of the game. In fact, I think it's kind of, even though the game is free, it's actually harder to Smurf now than it was in the past, because in the past, I knew people that just had like 1 million accounts and they just Smurfed really easily. And now, you know, people have to go through all those bells and whistles to get it, so it's a little bit trickier. But overall, it's not something that will deny you the rank that you deserve if you deserve it and you play enough games. But anyways, these are the 10 misconceptions that I have. Definitely let me know if you think I got any wrong or I missed any in the comments down below. Thank you so much for coming by. I really hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you next time.